Yes, we have to say it. Remember, this is just a football game, no matter who wins or loses. An unspeakable tragedy confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City, the most famous, perhaps, of all of the Beatles, shot twice in the back, rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, dead on arrival. Hard to go back to the game after that news flash, which in duty bound we had to take. Frank?
Indeed it is.
In case the folks missed the earlier news flash, ABC News has confirmed that John Lennon, a member of the famed Beatles, maybe the best known member, was shot twice in the back outside of his apartment building in the west side of New York tonight, rushed to the Roosevelt Hospital, dead on arrival. An unspeakable tragedy. Details on Nightline 30 minutes after the end of this contest.
This is ABC.
John Lennon murdered in New York. We'll have a report. Good evening. The focus of our broadcast tonight was and remains the situation in Poland. But late this evening, one of the world's great entertainers and musicians, John Lennon of the Beatles, was shot outside his New York home. So we begin tonight by bringing you up to date on that story. John Lennon was shot 3 times at around 11 p.m. Eastern Time. He was rushed to New York's Roosevelt Hospital, but died a few minutes later. Police have a suspect in custody whom they describe only as a local screwball. More now from Roseanne Scamadella in New York with a background report on John Lennon.
Lennon was born in the tough industrial town of Liverpool, England. He met up with George Harrison in 1958, Paul McCartney in 1959, Ringo Starr a few years later, and the rest is history. The Beatles' sound was unique and captured the public's imagination. The group would sell more #1 records in the 60s than any other. In the 70s, Lennon performed as a solo artist with more success. Ironically, Lennon's death came at a time when he was making a comeback. He had just recorded his first record in 5 years.
Standing by now in our studios in New York is Geraldo Rivera, who has covered John Lennon both as a personality and an artist for many years now, and saw him last just 6 weeks ago. Geraldo?
Thank you very much, Ted. Roseanne mentioned that the most tragic aspect of this terrible thing is the ironic thing about the fact that John Lennon was back. John Lennon, after a 5-year absence, was finally back in the studios, had finally released a record album that was receiving general acclamation from the fans. He was back not as the philosopher Lennon, not as the political Lennon, not as the Lennon who makes a lot of domestic news for his style and flamboyance, but rather as the musician. That's how we got to know him initially, as a great musician and lyricist, as a person who, as one of the cornerstones of one of the most incredible musical units in the history of the planet, changed the course of rock and roll, changed the course of many of our lives, set the tone and style, I think it's fair to say, for the late 60s, right up until the group broke up. It's more than 10 years since the Beatles broke up, and there are still many, many radio stations in many cities in this country and around the world that still devote considerable time, commercial-free hours, to the Beatles' music. That's how important they were. Once he married Yoko, the kind of feeling toward John changed. There was a resentment. Number one, there was a feeling that he was the person that caused the breakup of the Beatles, and then there was an enormous amount of hate directed toward Yoko, and a lot of pressure on John to split from her, to go back to the predictable, the heavy camaraderie of the Beatles that we came to know John as in the 60s. But he resisted that pressure. He stuck it out with Yoko. He stayed true to his own principles. He said very recently that he wanted to break up from the Beatles 4 years before they actually did break up, that he wanted to set out on his own. And Yoko provided the security blanket that John needed to strike out on his own. I remember in 1972, I sort of coaxed him out of seclusion to do a benefit concert for the mentally retarded, and he graciously agreed despite the fact that he really hadn't played in public for over 2 years, and despite the fact that he had that tremendous insecurity of not having the format of the Beatles behind him. He still came out and he raised over $160,000 for the mentally retarded. Shortly after that concert in '72, I'd say '73, '74, John was very confused about where he was going. For one thing, he was really being persecuted by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. They wanted to deport him for a relatively obscure marijuana case that had happened overseas years before, but they really gave him a hard time. And he was really heartened by the fact that many people in the music business and in the media rallied to his support. When I think, I'm trying to put my thoughts in order and give them to you in a logical way, but the painful aspect of what's happened has really skewed my reasoning on it.
Well, let's just stop for one moment and bring people up to date. First of all, the man was 40 years old. I think we should point out that all of this happened just a little more than 90 minutes ago. So if this seems a little bit disjointed and confused, it is only because the event just happened. John Lennon was shot. Apparently, he was shot 3 times. He was shot outside an apartment building called the Dakota, which is on West 72nd Street in New York. Apparently, a lot of show business people live at the Dakota. What kind of a life did he lead in New York, Geraldo? Was it a very visible one, or was very seclusive?
It was very secluded between 1974 and '75 until very recently. I was jogging in Central Park 2 months ago and ran into John and Yoko 6 weeks ago on the corner. And they seemed very happy, very buoyant. He had completed the work on the album, Starting Over. Both John and Yoko had a very positive outlook about the future. They had turned a corner in their personal life. He lived in the Dakota. He had several co-ops in that very prestigious building. He had his office there. He had his home there. He had a place for Yoko there. They still lived, they surfaced once in a while for a print interview to promote the album, or they appeared, but rarely. They weren't media people anymore, certainly not to the extent the media pursued them. They resisted that. It really seemed to me with this album that John was back, that John really wanted to reward the fans that had remained loyal to him during the 10 years of that transition from the Beatles until this tragic event this evening.
All right, Geraldo, thank you very much indeed. What we want to do right now is to go to Lynn Scher, who is outside Roosevelt Hospital. Lynn, just bring us up to date, would you? What happened? How did it happen? Under what circumstances did John Lennon die?
Apparently, Ted, it happened around 10 o'clock this evening. John Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, I'm told were returning from a recording session or somewhere else in a limousine, got out of the limousine to their apartment at the Dakota, where they were shot by a man who has been described, as you have said, by the police as deranged or a kook or something like that. Immediately, John Lennon was brought right here to Roosevelt Hospital. This is only about 13 blocks away from his apartment, so it didn't take too long to get him here. According to Dr. Stephen Lynn, who's the director of emergency room services here, he just gave us a briefing. He said that Lennon was brought here this evening shortly before 11 p.m. He was dead on arrival. There were extensive resuscitation efforts that were made, but none of them did any good. There were transfusions that were attempted. None of them were able to save his life. He apparently had multiple wounds in his chest. The doctor said there were 7 wounds, but he could not tell exactly how many bullet shots that meant. He knew that it was a gun, but he couldn't say what kind of gun, nor could he say how close the shots had been fired, nor whether they were from the front or from the rear. He said there was signs of injuries of the major blood vessel in his chest, and that is clearly what he died from. Also, the doctor said that apparently Lennon was dead at the moment of the first shot. He could tell that by the size of the injuries. Once again, they tried everything that they could to revive him, and there was absolutely nothing they could do. And once again, the suspect is in custody. Yoko Ono was here with John Lennon when he was brought in. She was at his side. And the hospital has been pretty much surrounded with fans and other onlookers since the event happened. Ted?
Lynn, what happened at the scene? Were there any eyewitnesses who described what happened?
Yeah, Ted, apparently there were a number of eyewitnesses, and the police got everybody together rather quickly. They are all at the precinct right now. We haven't been over there yet. I assume that's where we're headed next.
All right, Lynn Scher, thank you very much indeed. That then, the latest on John Lennon, shot and killed this evening at the age of 40. He leaves behind his widow, Yoko Ono, and a small child. We'll have more on Poland in a moment.